For centuries, Japan was like an island, locked away from the tides of history. Its people lived under the rigid hierarchy of the Tokugawa shogunate, the samurai at the top, peasants, artisans, and merchants below. For more than 200 years, Japan closed its gates to the outside world. This isolation, known as Sakoku, kept the nation at peace, but it also froze it in time. Meanwhile, the world beyond was in flames. Europe was industrializing, its empires devouring colonies across Asia and Africa. India had fallen to Britain. Southeast Asia was carved up by the French, the Dutch, and the English. Even mighty China had been humiliated, forced to its knees after the Opium Wars. And then, Japan's turn came. In 1853, shock thundered through the nation when Commodore Perry's black ships appeared in Edo Bay. These steam-powered giants, bristling with cannons, towered over Japan's fragile wooden vessels. It was a brutal awakening. If Japan remained closed, it would be conquered. Panic gripped the court. One faction urged to open up and modernize, to learn from the West. Another vowed to cling to tradition, fearing that change meant surrender. The nation was divided, trembling on the edge of disaster. Out of this chaos, a young figure emerged: Emperor Meiji, only 15 years old, yet destined to carry the weight of an entire civilization. In 1868, he ascended the throne, ending the 260-year rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. This event would be remembered forever as the Meiji Restoration. From the moment he took power, Meiji made a vow that shook Japan. The nation would open its doors, embrace reform, and rise as a great power. He knew the truth: either Japan transforms, or Japan perishes. What followed was nothing short of a revolution. Samurai, once bound to their swords, laid down their armor and donned Western uniforms. The clash of katana was replaced by the roar of rifles and cannons. Wooden castles gave way to shipyards, steel mills, and railroads. Japan devoured knowledge from the West with ferocity. It studied Prussia's army, France's education, Britain's navy, Germany's legal codes, and America's politics. Yet, it did not merely copy. The Japanese took foreign models, reshaped them, and forged something uniquely their own. In 1868, the emperor proclaimed the Charter Oath, declaring, the nation would seek knowledge worldwide. It would build prosperity and strength. The people would unite for the sake of the state. A slogan echoed across the land: Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the nation, strengthen the army. And so, the transformation began. In just a few decades, Japan leaped from a feudal backwater to an industrial power. Modern warships flew the rising sun across the Pacific. Disciplined armies marched through Tokyo, eyes burning with pride. But beneath the surface of survival, another fire was kindling. Japan had not only learned how to defend itself, it had begun to dream. If the West could build empires, why not Japan? The dawn had broken over the land of the rising sun, and in its glow, a new empire was stirring, one that would make the world both admire and tremble. The Meiji Restoration was not merely a change of rulers. It was a storm, a transformation that would tear apart the very fabric of Japanese society. Across the nation, the old world collided with the new. Samurai warriors, once the proud masters of the land, now stood confused. Their sacred swords forbidden in public, their stipends abolished. For centuries, the samurai had lived and died by the blade. But now, the clang of steel was drowned out by the hiss of steam engines, the roar of furnaces, and the thunder of cannons. In the heart of Tokyo once, Edo, massive construction sites erupted. Western engineers arrived, their blueprints rolled out like battle maps. Shipyards rose on the coasts, belching smoke into the skies. Railroads cut through valleys and mountains, linking cities like veins carrying new lifeblood. The samurai's horse was replaced by the iron locomotive, its whistle echoing across the land. But modernization was not only steel and fire, it was an intellectual revolution. Schools opened across the country, teaching not just Confucian ethics, but mathematics, science, and foreign languages. Children who once memorized poetry now studied physics and engineering. A new generation was being raised not as farmers or warriors, but as soldiers, scientists, and industrialists. The government moved swiftly, with ruthless determination. It adopted a Prussian-style military, forging a conscript army where every man, no matter his class, owed his life to the nation. The Navy followed Britain's model, its shipyards producing steel leviathans armed with the deadliest guns. Every factory, every foundry, Every field of rice was harnessed to one purpose: the survival and rise of Japan. And yet, the human cost was staggering. For the old aristocracy and the samurai class, modernization was humiliation. Entire families were stripped of power and status. Revolts erupted, like the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, when thousands of samurai rose to reclaim their honor, swords flashing in defiance against the guns of the new imperial army. But bravery was no match for modern firepower. The rebellion was crushed, and with it, the age of the samurai was buried forever. From the ashes of tradition, a new identity was forged. The Japanese people began to see themselves not as feudal subjects, but as citizens of a modern state, bound together by loyalty to the emperor. He was no longer just a sacred figure on a distant throne. He was the living symbol of the nation's survival, the beating heart of a rising empire. By the late 19th century, the results were undeniable. Japan's economy surged. Its factories produced weapons, textiles, ships, and railways. Its military stood among the most disciplined in the world. And as the rising sun flag was hoisted over fleets of steel warships, a whisper spread through the corridors of power: "We are ready." Ready not only to defend their homeland, but to claim a place among the great empires of the world. The sword of the samurai had been reforged into the machine of modern war. Japan was no longer a sleeping nation. It was a predator awakening, its gaze fixed beyond its shores. And soon, the world would discover that the land of the rising sun had become a force unlike any it had ever faced. By the final decade of the 19th century, Japan had transformed itself beyond recognition. The country that once feared Western cannons now possessed warships of its own, modern rifles, and a disciplined army drilled with ruthless precision. But the true test of a rising empire is not in preparation, is in war. That test came in 1894. For centuries, Korea had been a tributary state of China's Qing dynasty. To the Japanese, Korea was more than a neighbor. It was a dagger pointed at their heart. If Japan wished to survive among Redditors, it could not allow a weakened China or worse, a Western power to dominate the Korean peninsula. Tensions boiled over when rebellion erupted in Korea. Both China and Japan sent troops, each claiming to protect the Korean throne. But the truth was clear. The stage was set for war. When the first shots rang out, the world scoffed. Could Japan, an island nation only recently emerged from feudalism, possibly challenge the giant Qing Empire? The answer came swiftly. On land, Japanese soldiers moved with terrifying speed. Their discipline and modern weapons cut through Chinese ranks that still relied on outdated muskets and poor leadership. Town after town fell under the rising sun flag. But it was at sea that the world truly gasped. Off the coast of the Yellow Sea, the modern steel fleet of Japan clashed with China's once vaunted Beiyang Navy. In a storm of shells and fire, Japanese gunners ripped through Chinese ships, sending them blazing into the depths. What was supposed to be the pride of Asia's greatest empire lay shattered on the ocean floor. In less than a year, China was on its knees. In 1895, the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed. The humiliation was absolute. China recognized Korea's independence, effectively surrendering its influence. Japan gained Taiwan and the Pescadores Islands. Enormous reparations poured into Tokyo, fueling further modernization. For Japan, it was more than victory. It was vindication. The whispers grew louder. We have done what no Asian nation has done before. We have defeated China. Across the world, observers were stunned. A nation once dismissed as backward had risen, through sheer will and discipline, to stand among the great powers. In the streets of Tokyo, crowds cheered, their pride swelling. But pride soon became ambition, because victory is never enough. Victory is only fuel for the next conquest. And so, the fire that had begun in Korea and Taiwan would spread further, fanned by the winds of empire. Japan had taken its first step on the path of conquest. The world had underestimated the rising sun. It would not make that mistake again.
The victory over China had ignited a fire in Japan's heart. But fire always seeks more fuel, and the next spark lay in the frozen lands of Manchuria and the icy waters of the Pacific. Russia, vast and unyielding, loomed over Asia like a sleeping bear. Its ambitions stretched eastward, seeking warm water ports, dominance over Manchuria and influence in Korea. But Japan, too, now claimed its stake. The collision was inevitable. By 1904, negotiations had collapsed. Russia dismissed Japan as an upstart, a nation of little men wielding borrowed weapons. They laughed in their palaces of St. Petersburg. How could an Asian island dare challenge the might of the Tsar? Japan answered not with words, but with thunder. On the night of February 8, 1904, under the cloak of darkness, Japanese torpedo boats struck the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. Explosions lit up the harbor, steel monsters groaned and sank beneath the waves. Without warning, Japan had declared war not with proclamations, but with fire and blood. What followed shocked the world. On land, Japanese armies advanced with relentless determination. At the siege of Port Arthur, soldiers stormed Russian fortifications through a storm of machine gun fire. Thousands fell, their bodies carpeting the hills. But still they climbed, still they charged, crying out the emperor's name with every breath. Victory came not cheaply, but it came. Port Arthur fell, and with it, Russia's grip on Asia began to crumble. At sea, the unthinkable happened. In May 1905, the Russian Baltic Fleet, having sailed halfway around the globe, met the Japanese Navy in the Battle of Tsushima. For 2 days, the seas boiled with fire. Admiral Tug Haihachiro, aboard his flagship Mikasa, unleashed precision and discipline never before seen in naval warfare. Shell after shell found its mark. By the end, Russia's fleet lay shattered, 22 ships sunk or captured, over 5,000 men lost. Japan's navy stood triumphant. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a European empire. The world reeled. In London, in Paris, in Washington, newspapers screamed in disbelief. The rising sun has humbled the bear. At home, Japan erupted in pride. Crowds poured into the streets of Tokyo, weeping, cheering, raising their voices to the heavens. The emperor was hailed as divine, the people convinced their nation had a destiny unlike any other. But victory carried a dangerous lesson that Japan could defy the West and win. The intoxicating taste of triumph fed an ever-growing hunger. The Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by America, ended the war. Japan gained influence in Korea and control over Port Arthur. Russia, humiliated, limped away in disgrace. Yet behind the cheers another shadow stirred. For with every victory, Japan's ambitions expanded. If they could defeat China, if they could defeat Russia, what empire could truly stand in their way? The rising sun was no longer content to shine over its own islands. Its gaze was fixed outward, over oceans and continents. And soon the empire would spread its wings further over Korea, over Manchuria, over the very heart of Asia. The world had witnessed Japan's power, but it had not yet seen its full fury.
The defeat of Russia had changed everything. Japan was no longer a shadow on the fringes of Asia. It was a predator, sharp and hungry, its claws firmly sunk into the continent, and its eyes, always fixed across the narrow sea, turned once more toward Korea. For centuries, Korea had lived in China's shadow, a vassal kingdom bound by tradition and tribute. But now China was weakened, Russia had been humbled, and Japan stood unchallenged. The peninsula, rich in resources and strategically vital, was no longer a prize to compete over. It was Japan's to take. The process was slow, deliberate, and merciless. Step by step, Japan tightened its grip. Advisors assisted the Korean court, Japanese soldiers protected its borders, and merchants guided its economy. Every strand of sovereignty was pulled away, until Korea stood naked and vulnerable before its neighbor. And then, in 1910, the chains were fastened. The Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty was signed under duress. The Korean king forced into silence, his ministers coerced at gunpoint. The rising sun flag was raised above Seoul, and the Korean Empire ceased to exist. From that day, Korea was not a neighbor, it was a colony. The changes came swiftly and brutally. Streets once filled with Korean signs now bore Japanese names. Schools taught in Japanese history, rewritten to erase Korea's past. Sacred palaces and monuments were stripped of meaning, their stones repurposed to glorify the occupiers. The people, too, were bound in iron. Farmers lost their land to Japanese corporations. Entire families were driven into poverty as rice and coal were shipped across the sea to feed Japan's growing war machine. Those who resisted faced prisons, whips, and firing squads. And yet, the spirit of resistance smoldered. In 1919, on the first day of March, it erupted. Crowds of Koreans flooded the streets, waving banners, shouting for independence, daring to defy the empire. The March 1st movement spread like wildfire, from village to city, from mountain to shore. For a moment, hope soared, but hope was met with steel. Japanese troops opened fire, batons cracked skulls, prisons overflowed. By the time the uprising was crushed, tens of thousands were dead or imprisoned. The message was clear. Korea's freedom was chained, and the chains were forged of blood. In Tokyo, the annexation was hailed as destiny fulfilled. Politicians boasted that Japan had become the master of East Asia. Newspapers proclaimed the empire's glory. The rising sun stretched further than ever before. But beneath that sun, shadows lengthened. For every victory Japan claimed, it planted seeds of hatred in the lands it conquered. Seeds that would one day grow into storms of resistance. Korea was bound, silenced, and scarred. Yet its suffering was only one step in Japan's march. The empire was not content. It hungered still for Manchuria, for China, for the vast riches of Asia. And as the 20th century unfolded, the rising sun prepared to blaze across the continent. But the brighter a fire burns, the more dangerous the darkness it casts. By the 1920s, Japan's empire stretched from Hokkaido to Taiwan, from Okinawa to Korea. But for the generals and politicians in Tokyo, it was not enough. Their hunger had grown insatiable, and their gaze now fell upon the vast lands of China. China, once the Middle Kingdom, was weak and fractured. Warlords fought like jackals over its carcass. Western powers carved spheres of influence, extracting wealth from its ports. To Japan's militarists, this chaos was not a tragedy, was an opportunity. In 1931, an explosion lit the fuse. A railway line in Manchuria, controlled by Japan, was mysteriously blown up. Though the evidence was thin, Japanese officers immediately blamed Chinese saboteurs. In truth, many historians believe the Japanese themselves staged it a pretext for invasion. Within days, the imperial army swept across Manchuria. Town after town fell, resistance crushed beneath steel and fire. The Chinese government, crippled and divided, could do little. By early 1932, Japan had seized the region and proclaimed a new puppet state. Manchukuo ruled in name by China's last emperor Pui, but in reality by Japanese generals. The world was outraged. The League of Nations condemned the aggression. Japan's answer: it walked out of the League altogether. The rising sun had made its position clear. It would not be judged by outsiders. It would take what it wanted, and no one would stop it. But Manchuria was only the beginning. In 1937, the fire spread to the heart of China. At the Marco Polo Bridge, near Beijing, a skirmish between Japanese and Chinese troops ignited into full-scale war. Japan's armies poured into northern China, their banners blazing with the red sun. Cities fell one by one under artillery and aerial bombardment. Refugees clogged the roads, entire villages burned. And then came Nanjing, As Japanese forces entered the ancient capital, discipline collapsed into savagery. What followed would stain Japan's history forever. For 6 weeks, soldiers rampaged through the city in an orgy of blood. Civilians were shot in the streets, homes looted and torched. Women, young and old, suffered unspeakable violations. Bodies piled high along the riverbanks. The world would remember it as the rape of Nanjing. The brutality shocked even hardened observers. Reports smuggled out described rivers running red, children murdered before their mothers' eyes. While Tokyo celebrated victories, the conscience of the world recoiled in horror. Yet within Japan, propaganda painted a different picture. Newspapers hailed the empire's strength, radio broadcasts called it liberation, and schoolchildren were taught to revere the soldiers as heroes. The rising sun was shown as a beacon bringing order to Asia, but in truth, it was a fire consuming everything in its path. By the late 1930s, Japan stood entrenched in China. Its armies spread thin but relentless. Millions lived under its occupation, and the empire's power seemed unstoppable. But the further it advanced, the more enemies it created. Resistance movements grew. Western powers watched uneasily. Japan had chosen its path: expansion through conquest, dominance through fear. But every empire built on blood and iron eventually meets its reckoning. And soon, Japan's ambitions would draw it into conflict, not just with Asia but with the most powerful nations on earth. By the late 1930s, Japan's armies were entrenched deep in China. Entire provinces groaned under occupation, and millions of lives had already been consumed by the empire's hunger. But for Tokyo's militarists, the conquest of China was only a stepping stone. Their vision stretched across the whole of Asia Grand Empire that would sweep away the West's colonial powers and place Japan at the center of a new order. They gave it a name: the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. To their people, it was painted as liberation. In truth, it was domination under the rising sun. But to achieve this dream, Japan needed powerful allies. In Europe, a storm was already raging. Nazi Germany had crushed Poland, France, and much of Europe beneath its boots. Fascist Italy had seized Ethiopia and joined Hitler's crusade. These empires, brutal and ambitious, spoke the same language of conquest. In September 1940, Japan made its choice. In Berlin, the foreign ministers of Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact. With a stroke of the pen, Japan aligned itself with the Axis powers. The pact promised mutual support. If any of the three nations were attacked by a country not already at war, the others would come to its aid. For Japan, it was more than diplomacy, it was destiny. Propaganda filled the airwaves. 3 nations, 1 mission: to reshape the world. The symbolism was intoxicating. For centuries, Asia had lived under the shadow of Western empires. Now, Japan stood shoulder to shoulder with Europe's fiercest powers, declaring itself equal, perhaps even superior to the nations that once humiliated its neighbors. But the pact was more than symbolism. It emboldened Japan's next moves. With Europe consumed by Hitler's wars, Western colonies in Asia stood vulnerable. French Indochina, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, these lands brimmed with the resources Japan's war machine craved: rubber, oil, tin, rice. The military planners in Tokyo drew maps with greedy precision. They envisioned an empire stretching from the icy steppes of Manchuria to the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia, from the Pacific Islands to the Indian Ocean, an empire that would rival any the world had ever known. Yet behind the triumphal speeches and parades, there was unease. The United States watched with growing alarm. American sanctions squeezed Japan's economy, cutting off vital supplies of oil and steel. Diplomats warned Tokyo that its path led to ruin. But in the barracks and war rooms, generals and admirals whispered a darker truth. If America stood in their way, America would have to fall. By tying its fate to Hitler's Reich and Mussolini's empire, Japan had committed to a path of no return. The rising sun now burned brighter than ever, but its fire was spreading into tinder it could not control. In the streets of Tokyo, banners waved and children saluted, chanting songs of empire. In Berlin and Rome, leaders toasted their new partner across the seas. Together, they promised to divide the world into spheres of power. The pact was signed in ink, but it was sealed in blood. For from this moment forward, Japan's war was no longer Asia's war. It was the world's war. And soon, that war would ignite with a fury no one could imagine. when Japan chose to strike at the very heart of America. The alliance with Germany and Italy had emboldened Japan, but it also tightened the noose around its neck. By 1941, American sanctions were choking the empire. Oil imports, lifeblood for ships, planes, and tanks, had been slashed to a trickle. Without fuel, Japan's armies would grind to a halt. The choice was stark: retreat or strike. In Tokyo's war rooms, the generals and admirals refused to bow. They believed destiny demanded expansion, not submission. And so, a daring plan took shape, a gamble so audacious it bordered on madness. The plan was to cripple America in a single blow. On December 7, 1941, as dawn broke over the Hawaiian Islands, the sky roared with the thunder of Japanese aircraft. Waves of bombers and torpedo planes swooped down upon Pearl Harbor, America's Pacific stronghold. Battleships erupted in fireballs. Sailors leaped into oil-slicked waters. The harbor turned into an inferno of smoke and flame. Within 2 hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay shattered. The Arizona sunk with over 1,000 men entombed inside. The Oklahoma capsized. The California and West Virginia engulfed in fire. The rising sun had struck like a dagger, plunging into America's heart. Across the Pacific, the blitzkrieg unfolded with terrifying speed. Japanese troops stormed into Hong Kong, Malaya, and the Philippines. Singapore, fortress of the British Empire, collapsed in mere weeks, its defenders humiliated. In the Dutch East Indies, oil fields fell into Japanese hands, feeding the empire's war machine. In just 6 months, Japan had carved out a vast empire stretching thousands of miles, from the jungles of Burma to the beaches of New Guinea. Never before had the rising sun blazed so bright. At home, the people rejoiced. Propaganda declared the birth of a new age, Asia for the Asians. Under Japan's leadership, the empire painted itself as liberator, freeing colonies from European masters. But for those who lived under Japanese rule, the reality was chains, forced labor, and brutality. Yet even amid the triumph, a shadow loomed. At Pearl Harbor, Japan had wounded America but not killed it. The aircraft carriers, the true might of the U.S. Navy, had been away at sea and survived the attack. Factories in California and Detroit churned with unstoppable power. The giant had been awakened, and it roared with fury. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war the next day. And with that, the Pacific was no longer Japan's playground, it was a battlefield against the most industrially powerful nation on earth. In Tokyo, generals celebrated victories, but some whispered the truth. They had awakened a force they could not contain. For now, the rising sun blazed across Asia, an empire seemingly invincible. But empires that rise too fast burn too bright. And soon, the tide would turn. Because on a remote atoll in the middle of the Pacific, destiny was waiting midway. For 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the rising sun burned across the Pacific. City after city fell, fortress after fortress crumbled. To the world, Japan looked unstoppable. But empires built on fire always face the sea's tide. And in June 1942, the tide turned. Far out in the Pacific lay a speck of coral midway atoll. The Japanese Navy sought to lure America into a trap, to destroy its remaining aircraft carriers and secure total dominance. But fate and intelligence betrayed them. The Americans had cracked Japanese codes. They knew the plan. On June 4th, waves of Japanese bombers struck Midway. But as their planes refueled and rearmed on the decks of their carriers, American dive bombers appeared from the clouds. In mere minutes, chaos erupted. Flames engulfed the carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Later, Hiryu followed them into the depths. For carriers the pride of Japan's navy were gone. Thousands of sailors perished. The rising sun's wings had been clipped. From that moment, Japan was on the defensive. But the empire refused to surrender. In jungles and on beaches, Japanese soldiers fought with fanatical resolve. At Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Saipan, they resisted until the last man, preferring death to capture. The phrase "gyokusai," to shatter like a jewel rather than surrender, became their creed. The cost was horrific. Entire divisions were annihilated. Civilians, taught to fear the Americans as demons, leaped from cliffs in mass suicides. The empire's victories had turned to ashes, but its pride remained unbroken. By 1944, American industry had unleashed its full might. Fleets of aircraft carriers, swarms of planes, and endless waves of marines advanced island by island, pushing the Japanese back. Cities in Japan itself felt the fury. Bombers rained firestorms on Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, reducing wooden neighborhoods to seas of flames. Hundreds of thousands died beneath the falling embers. And still, Japan fought on. As the war dragged into 1945, desperation birthed the ultimate sacrifice, the kamikaze, divine wind. Young men climbed into planes loaded with explosives, their faces calm, their letters home filled with poetry and tears. They soared into the sky knowing they would never return, plunging their aircraft into American ships in blazing suicide attacks. To their commanders, it was proof of loyalty. To the world, it was a symbol of tragedy. Youth, burned away in hopeless sacrifice. By the summer of 1945, Japan was cornered. Its navy lay broken, its armies isolated, its cities in ruins. Yet surrender remained unthinkable. Leaders clung to dreams of honor, even as their people starved. The empire that once marched with such confidence now staggered, bleeding, desperate, and still, it refused to bow. But the world was about to change forever. In the laboratories of America, a new weapon had been forged, one so powerful it could end wars in a single flash of light. And in August 1945, that light would fall upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, plunging the rising sun into its darkest night. By the summer of 1945, the empire was collapsing. Japan's navy lay at the bottom of the seas, its air force crippled, its armies cut off and starving in faraway islands. At home, cities lay in ruins: Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, reduced to charred wastelands by American firebombs. Millions were homeless, millions more starving. And yet, the empire would not yield. The generals still clung to illusions of honor. They whispered of one final battle on the home islands, of bleeding America so badly it would offer better terms. To surrender unconditionally was unthinkable. To admit defeat was to abandon centuries of pride, to betray the emperor himself. But the world had changed in secret. Across the ocean, in the deserts of New Mexico, a weapon unlike any other had been born: the atomic bomb. Harnessing the power of the sun itself, it promised destruction on a scale beyond imagination. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a lone American bomber, the Enola Gay, appeared over the skies of Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb fell. In an instant, the city vanished. A blinding flash turned night into day, then day into death. A fireball consumed everything within miles. Tens of thousands were incinerated in a heartbeat. Tens of thousands more staggered through the ruins, their bodies burned, their voices lost in screams. Hiroshima became a living hell. 3 days later, on August 9th, it happened again. Nagasaki, another flash, another city erased. More than 70,000 lives extinguished in seconds. The horror was beyond comprehension. Survivors described shadows burned into walls where people once stood, rivers clogged with the dead, mothers searching for children who would never answer. It was as if the wrath of heaven itself had been unleashed upon Japan. Inside Tokyo's imperial palace, the truth could no longer be denied. The empire was finished. On August 15, 1945, the voice of Emperor Hirohito crackled across the radio, the first time his people had ever heard him speak. His words were veiled, formal, almost distant, but their meaning was clear. Japan would surrender. The rising sun had set. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender. American generals watched as the once proud empire bowed its head. Outside, thousands of Allied ships filled the horizon, an armada of victory. For the Japanese people, it was the end of an era, the collapse of the empire that had promised glory but delivered ruin. The cost was staggering. More than 3 million Japanese dead, entire cities reduced to ash, an empire dismantled, its colonies freed, its armies disbanded. For Asia, scars ran deep: millions killed, millions more left in suffering under occupation. And yet, from the ashes, something remarkable would emerge. Under American occupation, Japan rebuilt not as a conqueror, but as a nation of peace. The sword was laid down, the empire dissolved. The emperor, once worshipped as divine, became a symbol of unity, stripped of power. But the memory of the empire remains a tale of meteoric rise and catastrophic fall. A nation that defied the West, conquered half of Asia, and in the end, was consumed by its own ambition. The story of the Japanese Empire is one of pride and tragedy, of brilliance and brutality, of dreams and nightmares. It burned bright, brighter than any star in Asia, and like a star that burns too fiercely, it collapsed, leaving behind only shadows and lessons carved in blood. The rising sun had set, but its twilight forever changed the world.